So good evening, everyone. We are continuing our BOA PG lecture series, which we started in the lockdown, and now we are continuing with the fourth season. Basically, all the topics we want to cover are which are very important for the general ophthalmologist and the PGs. So today in the series we have a uveitis case-based discussion, and to present we have our very own Dr. Rohit Modi. Dr. Rohit Modi, after he finished his MBBS from GMC JJ Hospital, he did his MS ophthalmology, followed by his retina and uvea fellowship in LV Prasad Institute. He is also FRCS and FAICO to his credit, and he works in the Mumbai attached to the multiple hospitals, and he has keen interest in PG teaching and also in the uveitis as a topic and in patients. So I welcome Dr. Rohit Modi for his lecture on the uveitis. Over to you, Rohit.
Yeah, thanks, Sumit, for a kind introduction. I welcome all our, Mumbai residents as well as the international audience. So, for most of the diseases which we have discussed on this platform, there is no much difference in terms of treatment and approach. When you see, let's say, a patient of any retinal disease such as diabetic retinopathy or retinal detachment, or patients with corneal disorders, or per se cataract or different techniques of approaching cataract. But when you see uveitis, there is a huge difference with respect to the geographical prevalence. So a differential diagnosis, the first differential diagnosis in India would vary a lot with what you would see in the Western countries, or we have a group of residents from Russia, so it would vary. So whatever differential diagnosis I am going to discuss today is per se more specific for the Indian subcontinent rather than for the whole world. But certain rules would be uniform in approaching a patient of uveitis. Plus, there is another concept which I have recently come across and I've started applying in my practice, is how to use diet as an important adjunct for treating inflammation in patients. And I have got fantastic response for that. So that part, I believe all of us should, explore more, understand more, and that can help in a long way. Hi, Dr. Swapnesh. So the first is I'm going to speak about how to approach a patient of anterior uveitis. Followed by we will speak about different patterns of posterior uveitis seen especially in Indian subcontinent. And last would be how to control inflammation using diet as an adjunct. Understand what is the most commonly seen posterior uveitis in our specific region. Now, when we are speaking about Indian subcontinent, it's mostly infectious uveitis which we commonly see, and the top three infectious uveitis we see in our country is, first is toxoplasmosis, second is tuberculosis, and the third is viral. In the non-infectious, sarcoidosis is one of the commonest, followed by VKH, rarely sympathetic ophthalmia, and then there are the other rare varieties. Whereas in Western countries, we see more of the non-infectious or the autoimmune kind of posterior uveitis. So let's understand the basic rules of the games. Now, the next few slides are going to be the most important slides in the presentation. Once you understand the different patterns of presentation of posterior uveitis, you would be able to classify the patients. Almost 70 to 80% of your patients would fit into one of the following categories. And once they fit into this category, your investigations get tailored, your differential diagnosis becomes quite specific, and you're able to treat the patient in a very proper uniform manner. The first is, if you see a single lesion which is a granuloma, which is subretinal, a choroidal granuloma. Overlying retinal vessels, if you see, are unaffected, though we can see a retinal hemorrhage temporal to the lesion. And it is relatively rare. In our country, it is mostly ocular TB, and the second differential is sarcoidosis. Though it was relatively rare, but nowadays in my practice, I do see at least one patient a month or 1 in 2 months of choroidal granuloma. And most of these patients are of ocular TB. They respond very well to AKT. The second is you can see a full thickness retinitis or retinochoroiditis, especially adjacent to the scar. This is a typical question they can ask you in your FICO exams or any international FRCS exams also. So if you see an active lesion which is adjacent to a scar, then we are looking at toxoplasmosis. It can be retinitis due to viral also, but unilateral, unifocal, adjacent to a scar, it is mostly toxo. Focal lesion retinitis. Rarely spirochetes. Now, here we can see a serpiginous pattern. Now, there is a difference between serpiginous choroiditis and serpiginoid. Serpiginoid is basically an infectious choroiditis, which is mostly secondary to ocular tuberculosis, and it is predominantly seen in countries where tuberculosis is endemic, like India. Whereas this kind of a pattern in a Western country where TB is not endemic would mean an autoimmune condition, maybe serpiginous. So these terminologies are different: serpiginoid choroiditis and serpiginous choroiditis. Here we need to further investigate, and most of these patients respond to AKT very well. The fourth is vasculitis. Now, vasculitis can have a whole list of differentials. There was a recent paper by Kaza et al. Where they have come up with some telltale signs. If they are present with vasculitis, then they are highly suggestive of ocular TB. One is this kind of a sheathing which is seen, or patches of heel chorioretinitis along a vessel which is affected, can be suggestive of ocular tuberculosis. Or else if there is occlusive vasculitis, there is neovascularization, there is a possibility of patient having ocular TB. So in our country, the first differential is presumed ocular tuberculosis. Second is sarcoidosis. Mind you, the way ocular TB can present, the same way sarcoidosis can also present in our country. In some cases, Behçet's can present, but Behçet's is panvasculitis. It involves arteries as well as veins. But in tuberculosis and sarcoidosis, it is predominantly veins. The other variety is your exudative retinal detachment. Now, exudative retinal detachment again can have a whole list of differentials. So if you see a bilateral presentation with multiple serous detachments, with this hyperemia, sometimes the vitreous cells are very less. You can see just 1 or 2 vitreous cells. You can see 1+ AC cells. This is, we are looking at Okanagan Harada. If there is a history of penetrating trauma or penetrating surgery, then we are basically looking at sympathetic ophthalmia. In cases in which there is a unilateral presentation and there is pain on ocular motility, then we can think of posterior scleritis. Also, sometimes what happens is we can get chronic CSR with some fibrin deposit, and we may think it is choroiditis with neurosensory detachment. Please do not confuse CSR with this. CSR usually has a unifocal, it can be bilateral also, but most of the times it is unilateral, neurosensory detachment. And this neurosensory detachment can exacerbate on treatment with steroids. So this has to be differentiated. There is no disc hyperemia in patients with CSR. So bilateral, leakage or sympathetic ophthalmia, unilateral, and if it is pain, posterior scleritis should be ruled out. B-scan is an important diagnostic modality for posterior scleritis. Now, if you see flat placoid lesions, now these are not elevated. These are flat placoid lesions which are, not elevated, and there can be associated atrophic retina, and there can be active lesions at the edge. We are mostly looking at violent retinitis. Patients' immune status should be evaluated. These patients can have peripheral involvement in acute retinal necrosis, posterior pole involvement with sparing of arterioles in progressive outer retinal necrosis, and then there can be a granular pattern or a pizza pie appearance in CMV retinitis. So patients' immune status should be evaluated. So because of the hard therapy for HIV patients, the incidence of CMV retinitis has reduced drastically in patients with HIV. Nowadays, there are a lot of times patients who are on chemotherapy, especially leukemia patients who are on chemotherapy, are immunosuppressed, and those patients, especially kids, have had CMV infections which we have treated. And one of the case series has got accepted in Indian Journal of Ophthalmology. Now let's come to sarcoidosis. It is bilateral granulomatous uveitis. Serum ACE is important, but serum ACE again can give a lot of false negatives because it depends upon the granuloma load in the body. One of the important tests is doing a HRCT thorax or a contrast enhanced CT scan. The patient can have alopecia, and these kind of hypopigmented patches can be seen in the retina. They usually respond to corticosteroid therapy well, and one of the other associations is depression. So that has to be taken into consideration when we are treating the patients of sarcoidosis. Other patient, like I see, you can see bullous, exudative detachments over here. The disc is not very well seen, but you can see the disc edema over here, and you can see bullous detachments, choroidal thickening bilaterally. This is typical of walk Koyanagi Harada. And after 3 months of treatment, you can see a sunset glow fundus which is visible. The patient was on systemic immunosuppressant. Today's guidelines suggest that we should start these patients with intravenous methylprednisolone, 1 gram a day for 3 days, and then a slow taper of systemic steroids. Plus, on day 1 itself, if we can start the immunosuppressants, that would be fantastic, instead of waiting for a month. Because earlier we start, better is the resolution, lesser is the chances of recurrence in patients of weak age. It is mostly seen in pigmented races like the Southeast Asians. You can see the patient having periocular depigmentation. Now this patient developed viral retinitis. You can see flat placoid lesions, but because the patient was immunosuppressed, so we had to stop the immunosuppressants immediately. And you can see that she has a vasculitis lesion over here, retinitis, and she responded to intravitreal ganciclovir immediately after stoppage of immunosuppressants. And this is after treatment with intravenous intravitreal ganciclovir. You can see the resolved vasculitis lesions only. So posterior uveitis can be infectious, especially in countries like India, where there is high endemicity of tuberculosis. Identification of clinical pattern is crucial. Now, for the audience who are from outside India, I would really suggest that you can, sit down with your faculty, make these kind of patterns which are prevalent in your own country, and then have differential diagnosis assigned to those patterns. Some of the patterns, when we're talking about viral retinitis or we are talking about Vokoyanagi Harada, they will not change. But when we are talking about vasculitis, the differentials may vary. When we're talking about cerebral genoid, choroiditis, the differentials will vary in your country. And diagnosis is often clinical. So, a lot of times I have experienced that the patient gets a list of around 25-30 diagnostic tests once the patient has posterior uveitis. But we should realize that most of the diagnosis is clinical and we give tailor-made investigations. If we are trying to hit in the dark by giving 25-30 investigations, we are just going to waste patients' time and our time, because some of the tests can be falsely positive and then that can misdirect us. Infections require a specific antimicrobial therapy, and non-infectious conditions require long-term immunosuppressants, which may be at least be 6 to 9 months to 2 years. My thanks to my mentor, my philosopher guide, Dr. Somaya Basu. He is basically the director of Vitreoretina services and uveitis services in NV Prasad. Again, we are going to look at the patterns, and so let's say we look at. I'll tell you the next slide when I want it. So the patient presents with recent onset, unilateral redness. There's a slight pain. He's a male patient, and when you examine, the vision is around 6/9. There are 3+ cells. There is flare. There are no keratic precipitates seen in the patient's eye, and this is a first episode. Next slide, please. So this is the clinical picture. So what we are looking at? We are looking at non-granulomatous acute anterior uveitis, and the patient it's a male patient, has a first episode. Next slide, please. So what is one history which is you're going to ask? So you know that it's a first episode. You have examined, you have come to a diagnosis that's a non-granulomatous acute anterior uveitis. So if you are allowed to ask only one history, then you're supposed to ask that does the patient has lower back pain on getting up in the morning? This is very specific for patients with ankylosing spondylitis. Non-specific questions like patients, being asked like, do you have joint pains, knee pains, or shoulder pain or elbow pain is quite non-specific. For patients with ankylosing spondylitis, they have back stiffness, which gets better after getting up within a half an hour or 1 hour. So once they have back pain, lower back pain in the morning, that's a specific symptom. And which is one test would you advise for the patient? Next slide, please. So the test you're going to advise, usually we do not investigate these patients who have non-granulomatous acute anterior uveitis, and especially only the first episode, because the investigations do not help us in diagnosis, especially something like RA factor. Rheumatoid arthritis factor is not required. RA factor is not associated with non-granulomatous acute anterior uveitis. If there is sclerouveitis, then only RA factor has a role, or else please do not advise RA factor. And again, since it's a non-granulomatous acute anterior uveitis, we are not keeping a differential diagnosis of presumed ocular tuberculosis, and please do not advise MANTU. Now, if it recurs, what will you do? Will you then investigate? Can you press the next slide? No, go back. Sorry, go back. Yeah. So if it recurs, yes, we are going to investigate, and that time the most important test is going to be HLA-B27. Now, if HLA-B27 is positive, it just reiterates that we are treating on the right part. But if it is negative, do not, worry, because it can be negative and still the patient can have spondyloarthritis associated non-granulomatous acute anterior uveitis. Now, these patients have to be started with topical steroids, My favorite is prednisolone acetate. It is time tested. We know how the response occurs. Difluprednate, the issue is that there can be sometimes be sudden rise in IOP because it's a much stronger steroid than prednisolone acetate. That's why I prefer time tested prednisolone acetate. My protocol is to start early topical steroids and then go for a slow taper. For me, slow taper means that I taper 2 weekly. So that once I start early, then I put the patient on 8 times for 2 weeks, then 6 times for 2 weeks, then 5 times for 2 weeks, so on and so forth, so that the patient receives at least 12 to 14 weeks of therapy. This has shown to reduce the recurrence. Instead of going for a weekly taper or a 5-day taper, which will initially give you good results, but the recurrence occurs faster. Hence, the patients should be given 2 weekly taper. Another important thing is we should counsel these patients that this disease can recur, this can alternate in the other eye, and it can have a systemic association. So patients should be told that if it recurs, they should come back and show to you, and the same protocol can be followed. If the recurrences are more than 2 to 3 times a year, and if it is not responding well to topical steroids, or if the inflammation is severe, we can think of starting with systemic steroids and systemic immunosuppressants. One of the systemic immunosuppressants which is cost effective and quite easily available is methotrexate, which can be started. There was a time a few years back when I used to start these immunosuppressants on my own, but nowadays I always prefer to take a rheumatologist on board, though I do discuss with rheumatologists which immunosuppressants are more beneficial in a particular condition. Next slide, please. Yeah. So the other condition which can be presenting as anterior uveitis is, you can get button fat KPs, broad-based posterior sanity. Now, if you get a patient, next slide, please, with a clinical picture of this kind, where you can see a lot of mutton fat KPs, you're looking at granulomatous anterior uveitis, and in this condition, yes, I would like to investigate at the first episode itself. It's more chronic in nature. Next slide, please. So what are the differentials we are looking at? Next slide, please. First is, in country like ours, presumed ocular tuberculosis. Second is sarcoidosis. If it is bilateral with a sunset flow fundus or bilateral exudative detachment, we are looking at VKH. If there is a history of penetrating trauma, we are looking at sympathetic ophthalmia. Now, for presumed ocular tuberculosis, I have commonly I advise 4 investigations. The first is HRCT thorax, SOS contrast. Second is Mantoux test. Third is HBCBC, a baseline LFT, and RBS, because I'm going to start the patient on systemic steroids also. Now, if you see one of these papers, which I was a part of with Dr. Basu, you can see that only 5 patients there was only 5 patients in the whole group had exclusive anterior uveitis. Most of these patients had some component of intermediate uveitis. Most of them had retinal vasculitis or serpiginous choroiditis or panuveitis. So patients having exclusive granulomatous anterior uveitis are very uncommon, and their fundus should be examined because they may have associated other features which will help us in finding the diagnosis. Next, please. So this is another patient which we have already discussed, bilateral exudative detachments, which we can see with disc edema in 2A and 2B. If you see 2C and 2D, the diagnosis is pretty clear with the sunset flow fundus. This is more common in the pigmented rays. This is Vogt-Korenagi Harada. Now let's look at the third clinical scenario. And mind you, this is very common across the globe. You get pigmented keratic precipitates. Well, textbook says pigmented keratic precipitates, but in clinically, you can even get white KPs, you can get stellate KPs, you can get KPs in different patterns, but you do get KPs. In the chronic cases, you can get sectoral iris atrophy, and any patient of uveitis, if you have raised IOP, you are looking at probably viral anterior uveitis. It is very tricky to diagnose it and very tricky to treat. Recently, I had a few patients which I had a hard time managing these patients, and then controlling inflammation in the long term for these patients is a difficult task. So if you're treating a patient with raised IOP, one of the differences should be your viral anterior uveitis, and places where there is PCR available, their AC tab should be taken and sent for sample. These patients require oral antivirals depending upon what kind of virus we are suspecting. Many a times acyclovir works fine, but sometimes we may need to give, uh, you know, uh, ganciclovir also. Next slide. Yeah, so we can see the sectoral iris atrophy over here. So, like I said, yeah. Next slide, please. Sumit, we can move on to the next slide. Thank you. So needs tab valacyclovir 1000 milligrams thrice a daily, or acyclovir 800 milligram 5 times a day. And often a low dose maintenance therapy for many months can be given to prevent recurrences. Next. So another clinical pattern, quiet eye, mostly unilateral, stellate KPs all over the corneal endothelium, and iris heterochromia may or may not be present. What we are looking at. Next, please. Posterior subcapsular cataract is one of the, patient comes with diminution of vision and you see a quiet eye, stellate KPs, PSC. And these patients can have a lot of vitreous floaters, and they usually do not require any therapy in terms of topical steroids. So what's your differential? This is again seen worldwide. Next slide. We're looking at Fuchs heterochromic uveitis. Fuchs heterochromic uveitis, the inflammation is in terms of flare. We do not see cells. These patients respond very well to cataract surgery. The only thing is they have some vitreous opacities. So that's why they have floaters, which gets exacerbated post cataract surgery. So the patients should be counseled for floaters before cataract surgery. Next slide, please. We see raised IOP. The patient presents with something like 40, 45 IOP, few cells, and it's transient in nature. The IOP shoots up for 24 hours, then it comes back to normal. So what we are looking at Posner-Skolsman syndrome. There are papers which suggest that Posner-Skolsman syndrome is viral in nature. So some patients, some case reports have shown that they have responded well to antiviral therapy also. Next slide. So in summary, again follow the clinical pattern. In quite a few situations, investigations may not be necessary. When we are looking at, let's say, non-granulomatous acute anterior uveitis or Fuchs heterochromic uveitis, we know what we're looking at. And most of the viral anterior uveitis, clinical suspicion only helps us to treat the patient in the right way. Next point. Always dilate and check the fundus. It gives fantastic clues. Fourth point. Yeah, thanks. Again, I would like to thank my mentor, Dr. Basu, who's Director of Uveitis Services of the whole NPPA network. So I'm going to go to the last presentation of the day. I do not know a way to remember the lesions which appear hypo or hyper in the ICG. So, please forgive me for that question. How to differentiate on retinochoroiditis from chorioretinitis on the indirect ophthalmoscopy? Any specific pointers to it? So again, it's a fantastic question. Retinochoroiditis we typically say for patients who have toxoplasmosis. So in retinochoroiditis, you will see a full thickness retinal involvement, especially if you do a OCT. You can see that it is very difficult to differentiate between the different layers of the retina, or you can just see a hyper-reflective area pack. So it's a complete retinitis, and then some amount of choroid will be involved. And especially when you see the healing pattern, you can see a punched out lesion. That's why we prefer to call it retinochoroiditis. Whereas chorioretinitis is predominantly a choroiditis with some involvement of the retina.
Okay,
Right,
we
right.
started your presentation. Are you able to
Thank you.
see?
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, so we can just. So first of all, I'm not a dietitian. I'm still exploring dietetics. It's a fantastic branch, and we would be very happy that if we are being taught about it during our medical graduation and post graduation. Next point, please. Yeah, there's no financial interest. What I'm going to propagate is whole food plant-based diet. I would really request all the audience to, do a Google search on it to read more about it. What does whole food plant-based diet means? That we avoid all the processed foods. It's a whole food diet. Also, since it's plant-based, we eliminate all the animal products, all the processed foods, packed foods which comes in terms of bakery, or in India what we say farsan or namkeen, and we are focusing on consuming plant-based diets, especially a good proportion of raw salads. Here I'm going to discuss how these systems work to help us in controlling chronic illnesses. Now, there is a group of physicians known as Physician Committee for Responsible Medicine, which recommends a power plate, which is a good mixture of grains, whole grains, fruits, legumes, and vegetable. Once you have this, you're almost getting all the nutrition, and then micro and macronutrients, except vitamin B12 and D3, for which we all can take supplements. Next, please. Now, there was a case report which was published by Dr. Joel Fuhrman's group on efficacy on plant-based anti-inflammatory diet as monotherapy in psoriasis. I made my father-in-law follow this. He had a patch of psoriasis, scalp psoriasis. In first time in 15, 20 years, it is almost gone only on this anti-inflammatory diet recommended by Dr. Joel Fuhrman. He has a lot of YouTube videos. You guys can watch that. Next. The other paper which I came across was for lupus nephritis, and there's a doctor known as Dr. Brooke Goldner. Her focus is on raw salads, making vegetable smoothies, preferably from green vegetables, and she combines it with grounded flax seeds or grounded chia seeds. It's a powerful anti-inflammatory combination, and I would discuss in my further slides why it is so powerful. Next slide, please. So when we are looking at arachidonic acid, which is one of the important intermediaries in production of prostaglandins in the body, which is basically the inflammatory mediators, almost all sources are from animal sources. When we are talking about, let's say, red meat, beef, or we're talking about dairy or poultry, all these contain various amounts of arachidonic acid. Next, please. And this arachidonic acid basically gets broken down into leukotriene B4, cysteine leukotrienes, prostaglandins, which cause a lot of inflammation. Next slide, please. And when we look at omega-3 fatty acids, now these are essential fatty acids which we get from flax seeds, chia seeds, and algae. They give rise to alpha-linoleic acid, which ultimately gets converted into PGE3 and LTB5, which are anti-inflammatory in nature. Next slide. Now, what happens is if we stop the consumption of vegetable oils, animal fats, processed foods, almost all the delta 6 desaturates gets focused on converting ALA to SA and then EA and then to EPA and DHA, which ultimately gives rise to anti-inflammatory prostaglandin E3 and LTB5. And this gets inhibitory to the arachidonic acid pathway, and your pro-inflammatory PGE2 and LTB4 are produced in a much lesser concentration. So you're acting in two ways. First, you're reducing the intake of linoleic acid, and you're increasing the intake of alpha-linoleic acid. That's why your delta C6 desaturase, which is a rate-limiting enzyme, gets completely focused on converting the ALA to anti-inflammatory mediators. Next slide, please. And in one of the papers, Dr. John McDougall had reported effects of very low-fat vegan diet in subjects with rheumatoid arthritis, and he saw that inflammatory mediators decreased significantly and also weight reduced significantly. Now, there's obviously, we all know that when we go on a vegan diet, especially we avoid processed foods, low fat diet, you're going to lose weight. And once you lose weight, you're automatically going to get better with, diseases like rheumatoid arthritis. Next slide, please. So what another group did was they removed the effect of weight loss on inflammation, and then they saw fantastic effects. Next slide, please. They saw that a low glycemic, high fiber, low protein diet could mediate inflammation by decreasing the pro-inflammatory gene expression. So mind you, even if a patient has a pro-inflammatory gene, they can be suppressed by taking an appropriate diet, improving insulin sensitivity even after the reductions in inflammatory markers due to weight loss were compensated for. So that was really interesting. It's not just a weight loss, it is something beyond that. Next slide, please. And so, and another thing which we have come across, mind you, this is going to be the thing in future. We are going to actually measure the gut microbiome, and we are going to decide what kind of therapy a patient is going to receive. Like our genes, our gut microbiome is going to, decide the therapy what we're going to receive. It's going to be more of a customized therapy. We are going to pop up pills taking certain gut microbiome to increase them. There's a lot of research going on this, and just wait for next 5 to 10 years. Gut microbiome is going to be the next big thing. Microbiome is already a big thing. So if we are having a dietary fiber deprived gut microbiota, it decreases the colonic mucus barrier and enhances the pathogen susceptibility. Next slide, please. So here we can see in the first half, you can see that there's an intact gut barrier because there's a fiber-rich diet taken. And once you take a fiber-free diet, that is essentially the animal food-based diet or a processed food diet, the barrier is hampered and there is a greater chances of pathogenic invasion. Next slide, please. And this translocation of gut microbiota drives autoimmunity, and this has been proven. Next slide, please. So this triggers autoimmune responses in a genetic background predisposing autoimmunity. So that's where. So if you have a patient who is prone to developing autoimmune diseases, and you have a dietary fiber, depleted diet, then your gut barrier is not functioning properly. There can be translocation of certain gut pathobiont like enterococcus to the liver and can trigger autoimmunity. So that's why your gut microbiome is very important. Next slide, please. Another thing which we know and we routinely see a common association is type 2 diabetes. This was one of the beautiful landmark studies done by Dr. Neil Barnard to show how a low-fat vegan diet, that's a whole food plant-based diet, had a miraculous effect on controlling glycosylated hemoglobin, weight, cholesterol. Next, please. In patients with type 2 diabetes as compared to the standard American diabetic association diet. So it was not, patients were just put on the vegan diet and they were given junk on the other group. They were compared with the standard American diabetic association diet. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, whole food plant-based diet has an anti-inflammatory effect. It can be useful as an adjunct tool. We are still exploring how it can actually benefit, but definitely I have seen benefits in quite a few of my patients who are not responding to the standard therapy alone. More data is required. Can we customize it to our patients is still unknown. Next. Will customization help is still one of the answers which are still yet to be answered. Yeah. I would like to thank Dr. Basu again, Dr. Anand Kumta, who introduced me to the concept. Dr. Michael Greger, I would request everybody to visit the website nutritionfacts.org. It's really interesting. It will answer a lot of your queries. And then there are YouTube talks by a whole list of speakers. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, BOA, for giving me the opportunity. And I'm sorry if I deviated from the core topic today.
No, thank you, Rohit. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you for adding that and motivating us post Diwali. The diet.
Thanks, sir. Thanks.
So
Sumit, do we have any questions?
yeah, we do have, sir, a few questions.
Yeah.
I think where were we? Retinochoroiditis question is done. Correct. Thrombosis question. What specific advice to give for a cataract surgery in Fuchs?
Yeah, so in Fuchs, first of all, I would go for a more slower taper of topical steroids. So I'm not expecting an exacerbation of inflammation, just to be on the safer side. And always counsel the patients for floaters, because that can become a big problem in the post-op if you have not explained the patient about floaters in the pre-op. Another thing is, during cataract surgery, sometimes there can be certain vessels, micro vessels, which can be at the angle, which can leak, which can bleed during the surgery.
Okay, Rohit, then Fuchs typically they say the steroids don't play much role for the inflammation.
Right,
So,
right.
but do you recommend giving it pre-operatively before you go ahead with the cataract surgery, or you don't?
See, technically it doesn't make a difference, but I do advise my patients to be started on a week prior to cataract surgery.
Only topical, no systemic.
No, only topical, no system, because they do really well. I have seen them, they getting operated and then getting referred, and they were, put on the usual protocol of fast tapering topical steroids post phacoemulsification, and they didn't have any rebound inflammation or a prolonged inflammation.
And do you recommend any specific type of IOL for them, or routine hydrophobic is good enough?
Routine hydrophobic acrylic IL does well in these patients.
There's one more question by Dr. Asmita that would we treat suspected viral uveitis with a cyclovir 800 milligram always, unlike herpes zoster 400 versus 800 milligram as in keratitis? It's about
So,
active dose. Yeah.
yeah, so the protocol usually for viral anterior uveitis in the active phase would be 800 milligrams 5 times daily. And so the patients who we are suspecting with CMV may not respond to cyclovir. That's where, ganciclovir is more, valganciclovir, which is the oral form, is more useful. So, and recently I had one patient where, the patient didn't respond to oral acyclovir, and the pressures were rising, and even the glaucoma specialist was not able to control. We were really in a fix. So we referred it to LVP, and there they started with valganciclovir, and it responded. So that time we retrospectively realized that, it's a different virus. So, but I would usually start with 800 milligrams of acyclovir, and the maintenance therapy would be 400 milligrams twice daily.
Okay. Two practical questions, Rohit, here. Like
Yeah.
this 800 milligram 5 times a day for how many days you recommend? 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 10?
Till the active uveitis is there. Till the active uveitis is there. It can be for 4 weeks also.
It can be for 4. And then maintenance therapy, how long? Like in the keratitis, when we want to go ahead with the keratoplasty in such cases, we tell them that you might have to continue for 6 to 8 months, but you never know, the recurrence can happen anytime once we stop. So in this uveitis, what do you recommend for the maintenance therapy?
So maintenance therapy, usually we give it for around 12 to 16 weeks. That's 3 to 4 months.
Okay.
But if the patient has had repeated recurrences, we may even think of 6 to 12 months, like in keratitis. It depends upon the patient's profile.
And this PCR, like AC tap with the PCR, when do you recommend? Like in active uveitis, or you want it to wait, or what time exactly?
Obviously, in active uveitis, so that the chances of PCR coming positive is more. There are certain problems of PCR in our country where standardization is missing. So we can get a lot of false negatives. So that's a challenge. And then PCR availability in our country is also difficult. In a metro city like Mumbai, it is available. But that's so my take-home message from the whole couple of the first two presentation is that your clinical pattern and your suspicion is the most important. Because viral anterior uveitis, I have also initially misdiagnosed as non-granulomatous acute anterior uveitis. I was treating them with topical steroids and my usual regimen of acute anterior uveitis, and they were not responding. or they have very high IOP, and I thought they were steroid responders initially. And I started treating them with anti-glaucoma medication. And the rule I have been taught is do not forego inflammation for the control of IOP. So first thing I was doing, I will actively control inflammation as well as IOP. Let me just continue with steroids. And moment antiviral was started, within 3 to 4 days, the IOP dropped itself. So anti-glaucoma medications were not that much required after antivirals were started. That was a lesson learned. So clinical picture is very important.
Okay. Aishwarya wants to know why only PSP cataract and uveitis.
Well, there are multiple factors. I have forgotten the pathophysiology of that.
So actually,
So-
Aishwarya, what happens, as the lens is the growing organ of the eye, and the PSC cataract basically in uveitis what we have is a complicated cataract. So the lens fibers while growing, they start from the equator and the first they move to your posterior capsule. So anytime there is any hampering of the lens nourishment, these fibers first to get affected are the developing fiber, which move from the equator to the posterior capsule. So that's why in any complicated cataract, it basically present as a PSC than anything else. So that is one of the important reasons. Next, again the retinochoroiditis. Doctor wants to ask how to know which part is involved. First, retina or choroiditis. Like how do you call it as retinochoroiditis or chorioretinitis?
Yeah, so it's an important question. Now, see, when you are looking at something like serpegenoid choroiditis, I would say it is chorioretinitis or it is exclusive choroiditis, basically, because serpegenoid choroiditis is your, choroidal involvement is more. And if you're looking at toxoplasmosis, it is more of retinochoroiditis. This is in retinochoroiditis, it's a full thickness retinal involvement which is noted. And that's why we call it retinochoroiditis. It's predominantly a retinal lesion and some amount of choroidal involvement is there. So if you see a full thickness retinitis patch with some choroidal involvement, you're looking at probably retinochoroiditis. But if you're looking at predominantly choroiditis in terms of, let's say the tuberculosis patients, then it is more of chorioretinitis. Another important question which I would like to focus on is, are immunosuppressants specific to specific uveitis type or depends more on the other factors in patient's profile? So for the thumb rule, methotrexate works for anterior uveitis well. Azathioprine works for posterior uveitis well. That is something which I have learned. And you can start the patients with a baseline HbCBC and LFT and ask the patients to repeat these tests from the same lab. Nowadays, my rheumatologist prefers salicylic acid, salicylate, because he feels that is a better agent for immunosuppressant.
One more question. What do you include in the investigation profile for reoccurring non-granulomatous uveitis in the young without any specific positive history?
Yeah, so again, so if you're looking at non-granulomatous anterior uveitis, then I know if it is a HLA-B27 positive, then I wouldn't bother him to investigate more. Now, if it is HLA-B27 negative, and I'm sure about my clinical diagnosis, I would refer the patient to a rheumatologist to be started on a immunosuppressant, and that should be it. Probably I can even ask for an MRI of sacroiliac joint, and if there are changes noted, then I know that it's spondyloarthritis, ankylosing spondylitis, which I'm looking at. Then again, the standardization of your HLA-B27 is not there in our country. So sometimes we can get false negatives also.
Rohit, one more thing. In your lecture, you said that you will not advise a RAF factor investigation to this patient. it is not. It is in some cases it is associated with the uveitis. So why specifically not to investigate? Like,
So RA factor wouldn't, rheumatoid arthritis would not be associated alone with, only uveitis. It has to be sclerouveitis. So if there is an involvement of sclera, you should always investigate for RA factor. But if it is not, there's no involvement of sclera, because what happens is many a times these patients, who are referred to me, they come and there's a lot of false positivity also about RA factor. So, they get, and they have spent a lot of money on RA factor, ANA, dsDNA, and when they really required was just HLA-B27, they didn't require anything else. And sometimes these patients with presumed ocular TB, they get reluctant to go for more expensive tests. What we want to go for is HRSAT thorax, when they've already spent a huge amount of money on other investigations which were not required. So that's why I insisted that RA factor should not be ordered in patients who have only uveitis. For sclerouveitis, RA factor is one of the first tests which I would advise.
but if it is a child, like in a 10-year-old child presenting with the uveitis, in those cases the RA factor is.
Yeah. So that's pediatric uveitis. It's a different ballgame.
Okay.
Obviously, pediatric uveitis.
In
I'm
the
talking about
adult, more towards the HLA thing.
Yeah.
And one more thing, like in your lecture, you said for the presumed ocular tuberculosis, you will start patient on the steroids.
Yeah.
Systemic
So
steroids.
yeah. So the beauty of your ocular tuberculosis is only probably one of the few infective conditions where you can start with systemic steroids before you start with specific antimicrobial therapy, especially if it is threatening the macula or the disc, where it is sight threatening. Second is, now there is good data emerging from the Dr. Basu's group, is that patients who were treated exclusively with AKT in certain, like if you have, infective choroidal granuloma, in these patients, you didn't require to give even oral steroids. They were alone, they responded very well to AKT alone. Whereas patients who had a mix of infective as well as an autoimmune response, something like in serpaginoid choroiditis, their oral steroids importance is very, it's really important. In fact, some of the serpaginoid choroiditis patients, they require long-term immunosuppression even after AKT course is over.
Okay. So in this presumed ocular tuberculosis, you would not wait for AKT for 2 weeks and then start steroid. You will start in the first go itself, correct?
Yeah. But obviously, if the patient has miliary Cox, or if there is any systemic contraindication, I would, consult a chest physician. And what I usually do is I have my fixed rheumatologist and a chest physician who's on board. So if I request the chest physician to start, anti-Cox therapy, in spite of no systemic evidence, because I am suspecting it clinically, they usually start. So you should have at least one chest physician on board who agrees to your diagnosis, because many times if they do not find any systemic evidence, they end up contradicting the patient. And then it's a difficult task to convince the patient to start AKT.
So we'll take one last question, Rohit. Is there any role of OCT angiography or ICG in choroiditis lesions?
For choroiditis, I would recommend that, for choroidal thickness, Repso's OCT is a good idea and ICG is better. OCT angio would be more useful per se with respect to retinal lesions rather than choroidal lesions. I do not have much experience with OCT angio. I do not have it at my own private clinic. So I maybe my knowledge will be incomplete in this regard.
So I think we have answered most of the questions. So thank you all for joining. Thank you, Rohit, for a nice lecture and dividing into the 3 important parts. And thank you for enlightening us with the nutrition aspect of medical therapy. So thank you all, and we will continue our lecture series on the Thursday 7 p.m. We have a lecture on gonioscopy by Dr. Priyanka. This lecture and all other lectures will be available on the YouTube for your anything that you have missed in this. Thank you, Rohit, once again. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sumit, and thank you, Dr. Sopnesh and Leo. Thank you.